Hello and welcome to Media7, I'm Russell Brown. As the Rugby World Cup nears the final try line, we're learning a few things. For instance, an international tournament is not necessarily a bonanza for the hospitality trade. Adductor muscles are tricky things. And if the rugby is good enough, even people who swore they'd ignore the whole thing will watch it. I'll discuss all that and more with our panel of experts. But first, Sam Mulgrew has the source.
When rugby engulfs the world, getting a piece of the action is easy, no matter how bad or good the taste. There's millions of dollars floating around the memorabilia market, and it goes well beyond rugby jerseys and scarves, Rugby World Cup slippers, dog collars and miniatures. Private sales are a goldmine. These signed Y-fronts, apparently worn by Pine Tree, have been receiving a lot of interest, what with our groin issues. Also on Trade Me, a ball from the infamous 1981 Springbok match.
There is a stoppage. Smoke bombs have been thrown onto Eden Park at the left-hand end of the field. Smoke bombs, flares, being an attempt to come onto the field.
At Cordy's auction house, once-worn training boots signed by Joe Lomu, perfect for the mantelpiece. A smelly old shirt worn by Peter Jones in the match against the Springboks in 1956. Or this allegedly mint set of all 48 of the Cup's game programs for $1,000. It seems the only investment worth trusting is rugby, but would you put $10,000 on this number plate going up in value in the next few weeks? Nostalgia equals cash, but only for winners.
Sam Mulgrew there. Well, there is much to discuss, so let me welcome our panel. Sydney Morning Herald Rugby correspondent Greg Growden, our resident rugby boffin Tracey Nelson, and as he's known to readers of Le Monde, le Mouton Noir, Greg McGee. Welcome to you all. Now, Greg, I have to say, reading the Australian press this week, you guys fancy your chances.
Not
Would that
before
be fair to
time.
say?
True, yeah, we are. We are rather buoyant. I think we're so shocked how we beat the Springboks last week. It was one of the great escapes of all time to get through that one. And if they can play so badly and beat the world champions, what are they going to do when they play the alleged #1 team in the world? Yeah, well, there is great buoyancy there.
I do have to point out that your own betting agency, Centrebet, doesn't share that degree of optimism. It's still paying twice as much for the Wallabies as the All Blacks.
Trying to suck the punters in. You know, the Australians love a bet. So, you know, the All Blacks are favourites, but the Wallabies, they're unpredictable. I think they're a chance. I think we've got a good semi-final coming up here.
Now, tell me about the way you've been covering this tournament, because you've been here covering the Rugby World Cup, but you haven't been going to games, have you?
No, it's been very unusual. I've done every World Cup, but this one's completely opposite. Fairfax and News Limited, one of the few times in our history, have come together, and we refused to sign the accreditation forms, primarily because the International Rugby Board and the Rugby World Cup were trying to restrict the amount of footage we could put on our websites, restrict how we use advertising, and we basically told them to get stuffed, and we didn't sign it. So instead, we're covering it differently. Basically, we're not going to games, but we're still covering the games by going to pubs, watching on TV, and we're also not allowed to go to, apart from not being allowed to go to the match venues, we can't go to official press conferences, but so it's good old foot in the door journalism. We're going around ringing people up, chasing players, but the Australian team have looked after us. They've been
I can imagine.
It's that Irish
They're
spirit.
not going to shut Greg Growden out, are they?
No, they've been actually very, very good. But it's been a bit tricky, but I think a lot of people would not realise that we're not in the games. So it's been good fun, interesting.
Tracey, how's your tournament been?
Fabulous. Had 2 games up here in Auckland and it worked brilliantly. I was very impressed with how the traffic wasn't. The people were great. The street atmosphere around the stadium was fabulous. So I had a really good time. A bit teary-eyed during the anthem when I suddenly thought this was supposed to be our quarter-final. But
what's your impression of the difference in the rugby played in 2007 and the rugby played in 2011?
I don't think it's been as stilted, and there's not as much kicking. I think we've seen teams attempt to run. Of course, that was much to England's demise. They shouldn't have tried that because that wasn't in their repertoire, but I think overall the teams have tried to play attractive running rugby, whether it's being in New Zealand that does that or whether they've just decided, yes, defence is important, but you also need to be able to score.
Do you agree, Greg, are you enjoying the style of rugby?
Yeah, I am. I think also that the winners have tended to be the teams that have played innovatively and expansively and had some daring selections. But I've got to say, the highlight of the tournament so far for me has been that conservative old body, the NZRFU, threatening strike action. I'm expecting to hear that the red flag is the new song for team song on the All Black bus.
Well, I mean, it is fascinating because it appears this week that big game of media poker played by Steve Chu he's won the hand, hasn't he?
Yeah, big ups to Steve. I mean, he all the gainsayers, he said the timing was wrong and the substance of his complaints were wrong. They're wrong. But I don't think I'd be jumping up and down just yet because in that Guardian article that reported on the meeting yesterday, there were a couple of things in there that real cause for concern still.
And this is with respect to the IRB.
Yeah, the IRB meeting that appeared to give Steve Chu and the Aussies and the Springboks everything they wanted. There were still some things there, like the fact that it was described as an often stormy meeting, so someone's arm was being twisted. And then it transpired that no one there had any power to make any financial decisions. You know, and I would love to be a fly on the wall when the English and French representatives who were there last night get home, because I think some of the recommendations that came out of that meeting, the English and French clubs are not going to be happy with.
Greg, what do you make of it? Were you surprised that Steve Chu and then John O'Neill of the AAU came out in the middle of the tournament and went to the press with it?
I think there would have been a concerted campaign. This has been going on for ages. I've been sort of doing stories with John O'Neill about this for months, and for a while John was being on the front foot and Steve Chu was lagging behind, but now Steve's taken over, and I think it was a very, very clever move to do it. It got made an issue, everyone followed up, and then the day after, John O'Neill climbed out of the trenches and backed him up and said, we've got to do it. We even had a situation there last Saturday in Wellington where John O'Neill actually just wandered into a press conference and there was no chairs left. This is allegedly what he said. So there was a chair to the left of the stage. Suddenly all the journos saw him and pounced on him, and he pushed it again. So yes, and that meeting would have been heated because I know that the Australians and the New Zealanders weren't too impressed with Mike Miller's comments saying that the All Blacks were replaceable. That just worked in their court again. So good move, but still, as Greg says, there's a long way to go. Some of the people at that meeting are involved in the financial situations, but a lot of them aren't. And as we've discovered in the past, what's said in some meetings changes in future months when they go back to their provinces. Like the problem is the Northern Hemisphere countries are still very conservative, and the Southern Hemisphere countries know they've just got to keep bashing away to get what they want, and that's...
Well, I find it interesting that Fairfax and News Limited called the IRB's bluff over accreditation. Now the Australian New Zealand unions have done the same thing. Is the IRB going to have to back down?
Well, they've got to, because the point is for the teams to compete at the World Cup, they're getting themselves into financial strife. You just look at I know New Zealand's in financial crisis. Australia's similar. Australia's a different market in New Zealand. You've got 4 football codes fighting each other, and Australia are struggling, and they're even talking about cutting back salaries. They're relying heavily on that Sanzo money, the broadcasting money, to finance the game, and cutting back games is really affecting them. They're really getting cut back, and
if they
it's getting that stage.
If they play fewer games, they make less money.
Precisely,
and
it's getting to the stage where they're going to go to the players and say, we have to cut your salaries back, and that's where it's going to turn into an enormous drama.
Well, Tracey, of course, Brian Moore and other English rugby columnists were absolutely scathing about what Steve Chu did. I thought Brian Moore was verging on nasty. Yeah, what did you make of that response?
Well, it had to come out early because as soon as Australia lost to Ireland, it meant that South Africa or Australia were going out in the quarters. So someone was going home, so it had to happen. They may have held off another week. They may have held off until the quarters if these teams were all going through to the semis, but it had to be done. Yeah, the response from the rugby union and journalists over there, they almost seem to take it as a personal attack, and like rugby is England, and it's not. They need to grasp the fact it is a global game, And if they want to expand it, there's nowhere to expand it further. They need to look at, you know, the Georgias and Romanias. God knows how much it costs them to fly out here. And I mean, who was it? The Russians who had to have someone psychoanalysed because they didn't want to fly, and all these other things. But you know, it costs a lot of money.
I don't think Sydney's surprised that Brian Moore sounded off like that. He was always a vicious little bugger on the field, and he's a lawyer. What a combination!
Well, we'll talk a little more about that, probably about the English rugby press when we come back. But it is a game of two halves, so the producer will be out with the oranges and we'll be back on the paddock soon.